Good afternoon once again to all of our listeners. Thank you for joining us today for another Al-Attiyah Foundation interview, and to our special guest as well, Martin Lambert, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Martin, welcome and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Yes, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you.
Great. And so, Martin, after a distinguished career in the gas industry, you're now with the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. We read a lot about the gas research programme at the Institute, and of course, its work now very, very topical in the wider industry. Tell us a bit more about the programme to start off with.
Yeah, sure. The Institute's a independent think tank. We're based in Oxford in the UK, and we look at all aspects of the global energy system. We have an oil, gas, electricity and China research programs, but it's fair to say that the gas program is the largest part of the Institute. We're sponsored by around 30 key players in the global gas industry, and we produce independent research to help our sponsors and the others in their strategic thinking. Increasingly, we're looking at decarbonisation of the energy system, and we're in the process of setting up a separate energy transition initiative.
And you mentioned that gas is the focus of the Institute. The scope of gas has really changed a lot, particularly in recent years. You remember the times when it was just natural gas in the industry and a bit of LNG that made the headlines. What sort of gases do you cover now?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, so I spent over 30 years working for Shell in the mainstream gas and LNG business. And over all those 30 years, the product was pretty much fossil fuel methane. And fossil fuel methane, that's still going to be important and will be for many years. But it's now much more diverse. I started with the Institute 4 years ago, looking at biogas and biomethane. And then in the last couple of years, hydrogen's become a huge area of focus. And then even more recently, ammonia derived from low carbon hydrogen and maybe other synthetic fuels. So it's sort of an evolving picture of what gas means.
And a few key words you said there that I picked up on: bio, hydrogen, obviously quite a drive towards green energy, which is part of the wider energy industry. A lot of talk about hydrogen nowadays we're hearing. Where does the future of hydrogen lie, in your opinion? Is it high temperature process gas? Is it transportation, electricity? Where will it be most useful? And what sort of color do you think it will be? Another word we hear a lot about when we hear about hydrogen. Is this another transition of colors, do you think?
Yeah, there's lots in that question, because you sort of covered supply and demand and uses, and so there's lots of stuff there. So let's take the demand side first. I'd argue that the first priority is to decarbonise existing hydrogen use. So that means in refineries, petrochemicals, and making ammonia for fertiliser. After that, then steel making looks like being another priority area, so another big industrial use. And then perhaps ammonia as a fuel for shipping or for power generation in some cases. So also balancing the power grid by making hydrogen and storing it and then using it when intermittent renewables aren't running, that becomes quite important too. So quite a wide range of applications for hydrogen. On the supply side, in terms of your question on colours, there's blue hydrogen, which is hydrogen made from natural gas with carbon capture and storage. And we see that as being the first priority because it's more available and it's lower cost. And over time, move to so-called green hydrogen, so made from renewable electricity. And as you get more and more renewable power generation, then it makes more sense to produce larger quantities of green hydrogen, and hopefully costs will come down too.
And if we do change towards the more of a hydrogen-based economy, how will all of this hydrogen be transported? Do you think that's one key issue facing it? Will it be moved around as a pure liquid, as methanol, ammonia, or even by pipeline and then added to natural gas? Is that infrastructure in place for the transportation yet? Is it being developed, and if so, where?
Well, yeah, generally transporting hydrogen is a fair bit harder than transporting natural gas. It's a smaller molecule, and it has a wider flammable range than natural gas, so it needs to be handled with care. But having said that, it is already transported by pipeline. So looking globally, there's probably several thousand kilometers of hydrogen pipelines in operation already. And within certain constraints, current natural gas pipelines can be upgraded to carry hydrogen. But that hasn't been done yet very much. And so there's certainly not a widespread infrastructure for carrying hydrogen. But by pipeline seems quite feasible, a bit more expensive than natural gas, but yeah, should be doable. Transporting liquid hydrogen, however, looks a lot more complicated than transporting natural gas as LNG. Hydrogen liquefies much lower temperature. It needs more energy to liquefy it. And that's just really a couple of the issues to start with. So for long distance transportation by ship, I'm not sure liquid hydrogen will become a big industry anytime soon. Maybe ammonia, that's a more established route, that seems more feasible. But I think predominantly, initially at least, hydrogen will be quite a local affair, so it won't be transported all that far.
And is there one part of the world that's leading when it comes to putting the infrastructure in place at the moment?
I mean, so the existing pipeline I mentioned, they're mainly in the US or in Northwest Europe. So like between the Netherlands, Northwest Germany, there's some pipelines there that exist. But they're mainly sort of bilateral pipelines between a supply source and a purchaser. It is far from being like a natural gas grid that you see in Europe or the US.
And let's talk about perhaps one of the most important issues in the wider oil and gas industry, climate change. 2021, obviously a key year for climate change, particularly with the COP26 summit in Glasgow later this year. In the gas industry, we're hearing more about concerns about methane emissions and greenhouse gases. The oil industry is doing a lot to clean up its act. Do you think gas producers are taking it seriously enough?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. So methane emissions have really come into the dialogue, I think, in the last couple of years. And because methane, people now recognize it's a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And so it's been a wake-up call, I think, to the gas industry. In the past, there was sort of, oh, gas is better than coal, so isn't that wonderful? We've just converted from coal to gas and all will be well. But then I think people now realize that if you emit more than probably a few percent of methane along the gas supply chain, then that gas is better than coal argument starts to look rather more doubtful, and in fact could even be the opposite. So gas producers are now starting to take it very seriously, and to some extent are being forced to, I think, by regulators. So in Europe, there's quite a lot of talk about monitoring, reporting and verification. So the idea being that if you start to know how much you're emitting, then that's a good place to start in reducing how much you emit over time. It's a tricky challenge because it's all along the supply chain, but yeah, things are starting to happen, and I think people recognize the importance of doing so and understanding for each supply chain what are the methane emissions along that chain.
And one thing that researching for this that jumped out to me was maybe this new idea that some sun-rich countries are embarking on projects to produce electricity from solar power and then use that electricity to then produce hydrogen. It sounds like quite an inefficient, maybe even a long-winded process. What's the thinking behind that? And do you think it'll ever be economical enough?
There's certainly a lot of enthusiasm around the idea at the moment, and looking into the long term. I mean, so Europe sees it as being the way that hydrogen is going to be produced in the long term. And in some cases, maybe the only option is to produce hydrogen from renewable electricity, like solar power or maybe wind power. But in terms of efficiency, I think it's important to bear in mind that in any energy transformation, there's losses along the chain. And even say making electricity from fossil fuels, that's around probably at best 65% efficient. And making hydrogen from renewable electricity is probably about the same. So you get those sort of losses anywhere in the process. Also, solar power generation and to a lesser extent wind power, they're now in many cases competitive with making electricity from fossil fuels, and so you don't need subsidies anymore. But if you look back at the last 10 years, you needed subsidies to make it happen. So we wouldn't have got to where we are now without having significant government incentives to drive scale up and drive down costs. So probably the economics of green hydrogen are a bit similar. So today, if you look at the cost of green hydrogen from renewable power, it looks horribly expensive, much higher than hydrogen from fossil fuels, even if you add in some carbon capture and storage. But the expectation, or at least the hope, but I think expectation is probably fair, is that over time costs will fall. So with some sort of subsidies initially, which could be carbon pricing or something else, that will be required, but then hopefully then costs will come down over time.
It's great that you mentioned cost, because I wanted to come on to that. If I just do a simple Google search into Google and type gas prices, let me just read you the first three headlines that jump out. First is gas prices rise again. Second story is highest gas prices of 2021 cast shadow over holiday weekend. And the third one is why do gas prices keep going up? Tell us a bit about why you think they are rising. Is this a short-term phenomena, or is this part of a wider, longer-term trend, do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose it depends on where you Google too. I think one of your gas price quotes sound like the US version of gas, so it was gasoline.
I think they are, yeah.
But I think for gas in general though, so I think there's different things at play. So gas demand, so globally, is really driven by prices in, well, supply and demand in the global gas market, and demand in Asia at the moment seems pretty high, and that's in the short term is driving up prices. So so there's kind of short-term dynamics that are driving that. But then I think in the context of hydrogen, it's all around decarbonisation, and the cheapest form of gas is still going to be fossil-derived gas, and you can't get away from that. And it's going to be some time before a low carbon form of gas is able to compete. And so it would require either government legislation saying you've got to decarbonise, or it's going to be carbon pricing or government subsidies. So some sort of policy driver to make it happen. And so that's really what's required. And over time, hopefully, costs will then come down. But there's a question around how can the world afford all of this decarbonisation and who's going to pay for it? And that, I think, is probably what we're struggling with now. So there's been a lot of hydrogen strategies produced and decarbonisation strategies, but actually to make it happen is going to be something of a challenge.
And look, going back to hydrogen and pricing, do you think there will be a trading market for it, rather like TTFs for gas?
I think that's quite a long way off. I mean, by quite a long way off, I think a very long way off, because so the hydrogen market, as we talked before in that section on transportation, is pretty much a local affair at the moment, and maybe you get a few pipelines where over a few hundred kilometers something gets bought and sold, but on a sort of bilateral basis. Where you've got to, so TTF is the European natural gas trading hub. That's based on a vast network of pipelines all over Europe, many buyers, many sellers, and very much a liberalized open market. Hydrogen is nowhere near doing that at the moment. because we see hydrogen starting with these industrial clusters, which is like a sort of the Ruhr area of Germany, perhaps the classic industrial cluster. That's where it could start. Maybe get some supply from the Netherlands into that German industrial cluster. But it will take a very, very long time to get to it, having enough players and enough infrastructure and enough liquidity in the system, whereby you get that sort of European natural gas style trading hub. I mean, even if you look at LNG in Asia, there's been talk there that LNG in Asia should become a traded hub, and pricing should be based on that. But that hasn't really happened either. Even though you get ships going all over the place now, most of it's still sold under long-term bilateral contracts. And so my expectation is with hydrogen, that will probably look a bit like the early days of the LNG business. And so it will be bilateral contracts, long-term offtake, and quite sort of stable supply. And over time, it could get more liberal and more sort of moving towards hubs. But 2040 at the earliest, and probably even beyond that, I would guess.
There's still some years away. I just wanted to quickly touch upon China. You said that was another area of interest for the Institute. Moving forward in the coming years, do you see Asia, as you mentioned, is that going to continue driving demand in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, so speaking of sort of renewable gas and hydrogen, I mean, I've been doing some work recently on looking at China and at Japan. And so maybe take Japan first, actually. So Japan imports nearly all of its energy, and that's got to come from somewhere. So places like Australia and so Saudi Arabia, Middle East is looking to become large-scale exporters of hydrogen to supply markets like Japan. But that could be, as we said before, transporting hydrogen is quite tricky. So transporting ammonia feels like a better bet. So I think you will start to see some sort of trade of hydrogen-derived products within Asia. And so, Japan getting supplies from the Middle East and from Australia, that could be a place where it could start. On China, that's probably a bit of a different market because it's a much bigger land area. So a combination there probably of biogas, biomethane, and hydrogen. So China's already producing quite a lot of biogas, and that I think will probably carry on. But the main challenge for China in the short term is how to move away from quite so much coal. So there could be a transition in China which goes from coal, maybe initially to some natural gas, and then gradually to decarbonized gases. So I think a feature of this whole decarbonisation journey will be that different countries will probably do things in different ways and different speeds. So it won't be a one-size-fits-all solution.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot more political pressure to move away from coal as well. Earlier this month, for example, at the G7 summit, that was one thing that the leaders of those advanced economies agreed. I'm just going to keep rolling these off. Sorry, I know because we've got your expertise here, a lot of our listeners will be keen to hear your thoughts on a few other areas. Carbon capture, will that ever be a cost-effective way to produce hydrogen, do you think, or is it just, say, a desperate attempt by asset holders to try and prevent their assets being stranded in the coming decades?
Yeah, I mean, carbon capture is a very interesting topic, I think, also that's another one where it's not a one-size-fits-all. It varies by country, and so if you look at Europe, then the UK, Netherlands, Norway, they're quite keen on carbon capture. But elsewhere in Europe, I think in Germany, for example, they view capturing carbon a bit like handling nuclear waste. It's sort of very controversial politically. But in terms of hydrogen, making hydrogen using natural gas with carbon capture and storage does seem like the best way to start. And so we think that's going to make a lot of sense in the short term. And carbon capture and storage is really part of that solution. But the scale at the moment is really small. So globally, there's about 40 million tons of carbon captured and stored. And some of the projections are saying that by 2030, you're going to need many hundreds of millions of tons captured. So by one forecast, going from 40 million tons today to 1,500 million tons being captured even by 2030. And so that's a massive challenge. And of course, it doesn't come free. So the cheapest thing to do is burn fossil fuels. But with government incentives or subsidies, then carbon capture and storage will certainly make sense. We might see it in the UK fairly soon. The government in the UK is working on that fairly soon. Various countries in the Middle East are taking carbon capture and storage pretty seriously. To your question on, is it a sort of cynical way for fossil fuels to carry on? I don't think it probably is, because I think carbon capture, even if you can move in the hydrogen case beyond blue hydrogen to green hydrogen, then probably the carbon storage facility would have some other use for direct air capture of CO2 has been talked about, or using biomass and capturing the carbon from that. So my suspicion is that investment in carbon capture is going to make sense, and there'll be use for the carbon storage for many years to come.
And just looking at the uses of hydrogen, do you expect that hydrogen, the type produced by the green electricity we were speaking about a short while ago, will that one day become a reserve fuel, a bit like a grid battery?
Probably, yeah. So I think a general rule around hydrogen is that if you can do things by direct electrification, that's the more efficient thing to do. So, for example, if you can run a car on a battery, then that's great. Maybe you need hydrogen for a long distance truck. But it will certainly be more efficient to use the electricity directly rather than via hydrogen. Similarly, then, for balancing the grid, if you can use battery storage, that's good. But with current battery technology, it's only good for a few hours, maybe a day or so, if you've got a really, really big battery. But with lots of renewable power, you may get times when you get a week or so with not much sun, not much wind, and you need something else. And for those occasions, having made green hydrogen, storing it somewhere, and then use that green hydrogen in order to produce electricity, that's probably going to be the best way to balance the grid for the longer term.
And so it sounds like there are opportunities in green hydrogen. When do you think it will make financial sense for companies? A bit of a philosophical question to finish off. What do you think will drive those investments? Will it be the sorts of pressure we're seeing on the oil majors from shareholders to clean up their act? Or will it just be pure economics and lack of finance for fossil fuel projects as banks and others also try and become a bit more green?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's really about making business cases for commercial companies to justify investments. So I think stakeholder and investor pressure will and has already driven some sort of demonstration project. So people can make small investments to show, yeah, this could be done. We can build a small electrolyzer to make some green hydrogen, and we can decarbonize part of the hydrogen in our refinery, for example. But to do things at scale, it requires essentially governments to say, this has got to happen, and here's a regulatory structure by which it's going to happen. Because it all comes back, I think, to the default position that if you want really cheap fuel, then fossil fuels and emitting carbon dioxide to the atmosphere is probably the cheapest way to go generally. So it requires government policy to drive the behavior to say, now actually it's really important that you stop emitting carbon dioxide, and that then creates a business case for the required investments. So I think So all of those things are important, but I think ultimately it's going to be government policy that really drives the change at the pace that's required if we're going to meet all these aspirational 2050 targets.
Yeah, it's funny how often we talk about these sorts of issues with all across the energy industry, and often it comes down to the fact that change is going to need to be top down. We're going to have to leave it there, Martin. I think you've deserved a glass of water after the last half an hour, but thanks so much for your time on behalf of the Al-Attiyah Foundation. Thank you for joining us for this interview and providing our listeners and the foundation with your excellent insights, and we really look forward to having you again and hearing from you again in the future.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be here, and thanks for the interesting conversation.
Great. And for our listeners, remember, as always, watch this space for the next Al-Attiyah podcast in the series. I'd also like to quickly remind you to please visit the Foundation's website at www.abhafoundation.org. And as always, follow the Foundation on Twitter as well. That's at Al-Attiyah FNDN. I'm Naweed Jabarkil. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.